But now we have our next panel, which is on equality and diversity in collecting. There's been historically, women's watches have been seen as the poor relation to men's watches. However, in recent times, there's been a huge investment by the major groups and independent brands to focus their attention on this rapidly growing sector of the watch industry. I'm delighted to welcome Aurélie Picaud and JL Pomeroy, and hoping to see Misha Dowd, or also known as the Watch Fashionista, who will be discussing their passion for collecting watches. So, welcome, guys. Before we get into the discussion, I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourselves and tell us which watch you're wearing today. So, Aurélie, why don't you kick off?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the panel. So, Aurélie Picaud, I am in charge of the timepieces department for Fabergé. And obviously, I am wearing my Fabergé watch, which is one of my favorite ones. It's the Dalliance, and I love it just because it's like a little story with me and the watch, and there is a little surprise on the dial, but nobody can really see it, particularly on the screen, except myself when I really play with the light. So that's the thing I love about that watch.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. And what about you, JL?
Hi, my name is JL Pomeroy. I am a media executive and wear a lot of hats in the world, but always love to have my Panerai along for the journey. So I feel like I'm doing a watch advertisement, but I do love her. I love the gray band, which kind of gives it a little more character, and I just sort of I've always loved the brand of Panerai in particular, and it's ode to divers and being a little more utilitarian. It feels solid, and I always feel confident running about my day wearing this watch.
Excellent, thank you. I mean, we had a discussion previous to this, which was talking about the gender sort of specifics for watches, and obviously there's been a real focus on men's watches and women's watches, but we were talking, weren't we, about the fact that watches really should be gender neutral. The fact is that a watch is a watch is a watch. Maybe that's something going forward we should be looking at, because if it's comfortable, then why wouldn't you wear it? I mean, what do you think? I mean, obviously, Aurélie, you work for a brand that's historically been very focused on jewelry and high, those sort of types of items. I mean, what do you see from your customers in that area? What are they telling you?
I think that more and more we are going, even as a Fabergé brand, into genderless watches, just because, it's more like first of all, what we do in terms of watches is more like we call them like artwork on the wrist. So it's more about falling in love with something like you would do for a piece of art than anything. So it's not, to me, it's not really about the gender. It's more really about, again, being true to our values, to the stories we want to tell, to our heritage, what we want to highlight, and then that it talks to certain type of people, and not that one watch will talk more to a woman or one watch to a man, but more that it can talk to any gender and anyone. And it's about like a unique design. It's about key features, and again, all the story you want to tell. And so yeah, we really move towards genderless watches, because we can also tell that sometimes if you categorize a watch, oh, this is a woman's watch, like, first of all, my personal opinion is that it's very cliche most of the time, what people imagine for a woman's watch. But also, I think even from a brand perspective, it can really close some doors and some sales, just because if a watch is categorized as a woman's watch, a man would not be attracted to buy it. And same, not exactly the same on the opposite way, because the offering for women's watches, in my opinion, is very restricted. So that means that women, most of the time, we can tell, are very attracted by men's watches, or what the watches are categorized as men's. So very interesting, to see how it's moving now, because so many brands are trying. I find that sometimes even amusing, because every brand is trying to find what's the perfect watch for a woman. But I think it's more the language of the brands to women, which should maybe be adapted more than the design itself.
Yeah, because it can be slightly condescending, I suppose, in some ways, if you don't get the right tone. I mean, JL, you've worked with a lot of luxury brands in your career, and I think you worked with Cartier, weren't you, in a previous time? What when you think about it in those terms, I mean, how did they sort of, market themselves? I mean, they're very much in that sort of luxury space, but focusing on women, would you say, or is that a wrong way to look at it?
What do you mean focusing on women? The whole brand? No.
Well, I mean, just in terms of the watches, they're very, they had a specific offering for women in their watches.
Well, of
Rather
course they
than
do,
men.
as do all of the brands, as Ariel was
Hmm.
just explaining. But or Aurélie, sorry, I just said your name wrong. They, listen. At the end of the day, if there's high jewelry watches that have a lot of diamonds and are a little bit thinner, then certainly it's going to generally be more attractive to a woman. But I honestly think that this conversation to me sort of shows that in general, this conversation is a bit out of touch with sort of how I think consumers should be looked at these days. First of all, what is gender and gender identity? That's really taken a much wider lens in the last couple of years, certainly very late to the game, frankly, of acknowledging folks that are gender neutral or transitioning or identify as something different than society might push onto them. So I think, as you've seen on LinkedIn and any sort of major platform, people are identifying their gender as him, her, or, she, her, him. See what I mean? I just mixed two. So I was already being forward thinking. It's early here. But the reality of it is, I don't think that should be something that the brands and the manufacturers push onto a consumer. I think a consumer should be marketed to for their psychographic, not their demographic. So what is it that especially in luxury and especially in high quality products, right? It's about, when Aurélie was describing her passion for her watch, she described feelings and emotions and her connection to it. Those are psychographics. That has nothing to do with her being female versus male. That has to do with how she connects to this particular piece of art that she's wearing on her wrist, right? And I'm only referring to her as she because that's how she identifies. But that shouldn't be my decision as a brand, right? To sort of push that onto the consumer. And then I think when you widen the conversation to watches specifically, watches are, to me, very equivalent to cars and very equivalent to pens and other collections that people tend to cross connect. Generally speaking, watch collectors also enjoy cars or also enjoy pens or like have a little cross connect. Again, back to psychographics. And certainly I would be deeply offended if someone marketed a car to me because it was good for a female, right? Like cars are certainly not marketed to males or females. They're marketed to people. As should watches be, right? So I'm wearing a watch that absolutely would ostensibly be identified as a man's watch. It's thick, it's clunky, it's wide, right? All of those are like characteristics that are assigned to men. And I think that in and of itself is condescending, right? I like it for those very reasons that it's technically, offered to men. So I think it would be helpful to all of the luxury brands and all of the watch manufacturers to take a step back. And then I think if you go into sort of where we are in the world, typical of everything else, generally speaking, these designers are men. So I think when you have, I don't know what the percentages are, or Leandra, you might be able to highlight that, but I imagine it's in the 90 percentile that these designers and creators of watches are in fact men.
Absolutely.
I don't appreciate men telling women what they should or should not like. I think it's very much about thinking through a wider lens and changing our perspective about how we approach that. That's my perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right in that respect. That brands are, needing to catch up and needing to listen to their customers. And as a brand, Aurélie, with a long history, is that something that you're kind of thinking about for the future, moving ahead in terms? I think you sort of mentioned it before, but are you looking at doing your marketing in a slightly different way than you have been in the past?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So first of all, as I mentioned, we really go into genderless watches in general, and watches are even, my good jewelry. But also I think that what brands need and what we need, and we are all aware of it, and we have started really working hard on that, is really about the styling, the content, and everything regarding the communication we do should be also genderless. So yeah, this is really something we start working on. The watch industry is always, like quite conservative, I would say. So it's always, like quite slow to move. But I guess that every brand might have at some point to just go that way, because this is the way the world is. And yeah, I think this is like something. But for sure, as Fabergé, yeah, this is something we have in mind. Yeah.
Oh, that's good to hear. I mean, really, if we talk about the collecting sort of community, are you? I mean, we talked to some collectors this morning, all men, all probably middle-aged and white. So, it is about the diversity. I think it is about that. But in terms of, there has, I think, been more interest from women collectors per se, and I think that's really healthy for the sector as well. And again, are you seeing that people coming, in terms of your profile of your customers, is that changing? Do you see that? Have you been seeing that at Fabergé?
Yeah, like there are many women who are interested into watches, but I think that sometimes it's also sounds so much like a male word that it's a bit intimidating. And for example, even like watch collector clubs, or like it should be there should be maybe more and more women invited, and just in order that people feel comfortable first. And also maybe people are not into technique, but that can be again genderless, but that even if you don't know all the technique about the mechanical watch, you can still be very attracted by the watch, again because of the technique. Maybe the watch can tell a story to someone. And so I think that we have to be more and more open about all of that. And also as brands, as you mentioned, Jill, maybe like to have more and more designer executive who would be like just more open to all of those discussions.
Yeah, and I think that's really about the people coming into the industry and actually widening it out in terms of making it more appealing for women to become watchmakers, for want of a better way of putting it. But I mean, that's really an industry sort of issue, I guess, and that's something that we should all work towards and help that. So, in terms of your interest, let's talk about yours, JL. You have your lovely Panerai, and there's a good reason for getting that. But do you, I know you're interested in watches, but would you call yourself a collector?
I'm an
I know you like cars as well.
Yeah, I'm an accidental collector, or I would say, it's not something that I would identify myself as, but like when you and I very first met and sort of shared our enthusiasm for watches, I organically do love watches, right? So I think, maybe even that's a term that could be, rethought, thought about in a different way, right? Because it's like, how many watches do you have to own and be proud of and enjoy to be called a collector, right? Like, I honestly think that, you could be called an enthusiast, you could be called a fan, you could be called somebody who deeply loves and understands and appreciates watchmaking and watches as an art form, right? So I don't know that it's an interesting space being in this. You mentioned my background. I worked for Richemont for 8 years and sort of lived in that luxury space. And then I launched a magazine that sold, 2 luxury brands. And I own an agency that's 20 years old that sort of works with luxury brands. And so I've been in the space circling about for a very long time. And I think, one of the things that would be an interesting discussion point, I think, for the watch industry to think about is, what does modern luxury mean? And what does modern luxury mean in 2022 in particular, after coming, well, hopefully through the pandemic, right? This sort of changed world that we all are going through collectively, globally. And I think people are thinking about possessions differently. I think people are thinking about what is luxury differently. I know that I am. And I think that, my perspective on luxury is, time away from a computer and sitting on a beach. That's just as much luxury as buying a watch that would be considered as such, right? So is there a category that we can think about for watch enthusiasts that's like, how about you have the aspiration to own one amazing watch that you just love so much, you wear it every day? Does that preclude you from being part of these watch conversations? I don't think it should be. I think there should be democratized access to this world in a way that luxury becomes more accessible to people. To me, that is modern luxury, not being exclusionary, not being, you know, if you have to ask how much, you can't afford it. It should be an aspirational thing, right? And for me, watches represent generational giving. They represent family connection. They represent something that you would want your, in my case, daughter or granddaughter, perhaps in some cases, son or grandson to have. And I think that that's something that makes a watch special, right? So I don't know. I think that even the thought about being a collector is maybe antiquated a little bit. Not to be disrespectful to this audience, because of course we all sort of identify as that, but I think it's more about widening our lens rather than narrowing it. And I think when you widen the lens of who might be interested, much like our conversation a moment ago about genderless, you know, maybe it's also, you know, economic level-less, right? Like maybe it's somebody that might put a little bit of money away every day for 2 years to be able to buy the watch that just really, really speaks to them. And then it becomes something that represents freedom or success or a milestone or an achievement, right? That isn't somebody that could just like use dispensable income to grab a watch, like probably a lot of the folks that are tuned into this discussion. So I think those are some ways to think about it too. It's like, what if we remove gender? What if we remove socioeconomic class? What if we remove all of these predetermined barriers to entry and think about it differently? Because if you're talking about emotion, if you're talking about connection, look at what all the other luxury brands have done so beautifully. BMW has a 3 Series for a reason. It's to bring people into the fold and have them fall in love with that brand and then aspire to growing to higher levels within that category. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think there's something to be said for, it doesn't have to be about status. It doesn't have to be about price. It can be about connection and passion to the brand. And in my case, that in my perspective, that's where we win. I think that's where you win as a brand, and you have brand loyalty and you have brand love in a very different way than if you focus on price point.
Yeah, fascinating, and I think you're right. It's about redefining. I think you're absolutely right. You know, collecting is a sort of a catch-all phrase, isn't it? You know, you can, you know,
I think it would behoove us to think about redefining that, right? And it would be fun to ask your audience about that. Like, do you like being identified as a watch collector? Do you feel like there's, you know, some sort of feather in your cap on that? If so, like, listen, let everybody embrace their thing. Like, there's no judgments, no negatives, only additive, not exclusionary, right? Like, if you want to be identified as a watch collector, cool. But I think as you kind of like, as you kind of widen your thinking about it, I think you can start your collection with one, right? Instead of potentially having like a disposable watch that one might pick up at a, you know, at a department store. They're thinking about like the one that they really connect with. And most people do wear the same watch every day, or at least, you know, 1 or 2 watches every day, right? It's not traditionally the case that you would change your watch all the time, unless you're like really one of those folks that has the case and all the swirling holders, and every morning you wake up and think about which watch you wear. And that's cool. That's like on the top end of people who are passionate about this. Again, probably many of whom are tuned into this conversation.
Yeah, the geeks, basically.
but like, you know, would that be, you know, asking a parent, would you let your child who's a teenager wear one of these? That to me would be an interesting conversation. You know,
I agree.
Yeah, it's like I just think there's more to it than how it's been defined historically, and it would be fun to pivot on that. And
I think you're right. I think it's a great piece of work. But do you think social media's kind of changed that in terms of how we're, you know, we see all these amazing images and, you know, people showing off, I guess, in some ways, aren't they? I mean, do you think that's had an impact on this world, the luxury world, let's say?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a dangerous thing to position all of social media and all of this topic, right? I think social media can be used for good and evil, and it's certainly being used for both as we speak, right? I like the aspirational, you know, part of the world, but I don't like the part of the world that makes you feel, the part of social media world that makes people feel less than, or makes people feel like they can't achieve things, or makes, you know, there's particularly with young people, then the status symbol becomes, I think, false. So I think when social media is done well, and when marketers use these platforms, and I think each one has a very different feeling and messaging platform that's required to be successful on it. If you look at Instagram versus TikTok versus Snap or any of these other settings, it's like it becomes really interesting to think about what is it that you're trying to communicate as a brand, and what do you hope that your fans and your clients ultimately will push forward on behalf of that brand, right? If you think about, if you're setting the example, then how would you like enthusiasts of your brand to sort of push that forward? They're going to follow your lead in often cases, right? So is it something that is about passion and love and connection and human connection, or is it about price point and diamonds and weight of gold and thickness of band and things like that? And so to me, social media can go one of two ways.
One either way,
term. So yes, it does impact it, and I think there's a lot of responsibility in my mind on these brands to be mindful of how young people respond to the messages that are being put forth on these platforms.
And maybe I'll pick up on that, Aurélie. What are your thoughts of what you're doing in social media? How has it sort of changed and evolved?
This is like social media is great because you can, reach also, because Fabergé, for example, is seen, mostly sometimes if people don't know what we do today, as you mentioned earlier, so it's like a heritage brand, but people don't know most of the time that Fabergé was also very avant-gardist at this time, pre-1917. And so we want also to reach younger audience and, to make people aware of what we do. And the balance is really to find really being very true to your heritage and again all the values of your brand, but at the same time adapting to social media and all, because social media, that means you have to be quick, you have to have lots of content, so it's really adapting heritage brand to that world, and it's very, very interesting. However, it's a challenging exercise sometimes, and you have a bit to test a little bit, and also you have to still be very creative in order to keep also the people who love your brand for more the heritage side and all the authenticity. So it's really always keeping your authenticity as a brand, I think, even through social media, and even trying to be much more in day-to-day communication for us. So
I suppose it's being true to your values,
yeah,
but making sure that you don't alienate your customers that you have for the fact is you're going after new customers. So it's got to be a balance, I guess, in that respect.
And also something that we see to social media and on the internet is that people know more and more about watches. So this is also as a brand something to take into consideration, particularly on the point of sale. That means that you can have many clients coming and they know maybe more about what is inside the watch and about the how the watch has been done. So you have to be, I think, even more authentic and even more open to what you do, and very very honest, because people now can find information. So I think it's very interesting on that area.
Yeah, but it's also making sure they find the right information, because it depends on the source and where the information comes from. And I think that we often forget about that, and I think that's really important, that we're out there doing the right thing. So guys, I'm going to sort of bring this now to a close. I think that's a fantastic discussion. I thank you so much for your valuable insight, and really there's a couple of really interesting points that I think we should put out there. Let's get rid of the whole gender for watches. I think that's going to be an interesting one, talking to some of the watch companies who've been quite traditional in their way of, and conservative with a small c. But let's see where we get to. I think why not? Disruption, not for the sake of it, but the fact of the matter is, let's not put it into those sort of categories. I just don't think it necessarily works. And I think when I open the magazine and I see a double page spread on these are the best watches that women should buy, and I think, guys, it doesn't make sense. It's just not right. So I think there's a really good idea there, and I think we should go forward. So thank you, guys. I really appreciate that, and I hope to continue the discussion and talk about watches more in the future. So thank you, Aurélie. Thank you, JL.
Thank you.
And
Pleasure.
really
Thanks for having
appreciate
us,
it.
Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.